Hello and welcome to our webinar, Flourishing in the Face of Supply Chain Disruption. Our speakers today are Joseph Fiksel, Executive Director of the Sustainable and Resilient Economy Program at The Ohio State University and author of the forthcoming book, Resilient by Design, and Keely Croxton, Associate Professor of Logistics at the Fisher College of Business at The Ohio State University. I'm Michael Fitzgerald, Contributing Editor at MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. This webinar will be recorded and will be available to all attendees approximately 2 to 3 business days after the end of the live event. In addition, today's slides will be made available to attendees as well. We welcome your questions for our speakers today. To submit questions, please enter them in the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, or you can submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag MITSMRDisruption. A continuing Twitter chat with the speakers will follow immediately after today's webinar under that same hashtag. Now, let's begin. Joseph, will you please go ahead?
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. Keely and I have been working on this research for a number of years with several of our associates. Today's presentation is based on an article that we published in MIT Sloan Management Review last winter. What we're going to talk about are the turbulent business environment that we all face today, why enterprise resilience is important, and how we have tried to analyze the resilience factors that influence global supply chains. We'll talk about a specific framework that we've developed called SCRAM, and we'll conclude with some observations about how enterprises can improve their resilience. Well, we all recognize the world is becoming turbulent. Every day there seems to be a new crisis or catastrophe in some distant part of the world, and the ripple effects of these catastrophes can affect many different companies. I like this quote by Gary Hamel. It seems like it's all punctuation and no equilibrium. So we believe that resilience is a very important characteristic or attribute that enterprises need to build today. And we define it this way: the capacity to survive, adapt, and flourish in the face of turbulent change and uncertainty. We all have recognized that natural disasters are increasing in frequency. These data come from an organization in Belgium that tracks disasters all over the world. You can see there's an exponential rise. It's a bit frightening. And so the question is why? Why are they growing so fast? Now, some have attributed to climate change, and certainly that's one factor, more extreme storms and weather events. But there are other factors too. The world is getting more crowded. People are rapidly moving into large cities where they're exposed to large-scale disruptions of power, water, and so forth. And the world is increasingly connected because we have a globalized economy where companies depend upon suppliers in different parts of the world. You may have heard the term Black Swan, made famous by a book by a gentleman named Taleb, who's written a number of books on this subject. It seems like black swans are becoming more common, and some people talk about gray swans. Black swans are events that we could never possibly predict, and yet after they happen, we realize that they were much more probable than we originally thought. Things like the Icelandic volcano, the Fukushima disaster, there's a long list. We've also studied the impacts of catastrophic events or supply chain disruptions on companies, and clearly there's an impact on shareholder value. The average loss of shareholder value for such events, this is based on a study of 62 supply chain disruptions over a 6-year period. You can see the average drop around the time of the event was 7% of shareholder value. And there are many companies that do not recover for months after the event. So this is of concern to all enterprises. So the question we posed is, how can companies be better prepared? How can they adapt to things that are unexpected, even if they don't foresee the event? Can they be resilient in responding and recovering? Now, a lot of people have proposed that we use risk management methods for dealing with these threats of disruptions. And the fact is that enterprise risk management is a very well-developed practice. Most major companies have adopted some form of this process, which you see here. COSO stands for this is the Treadway Commission, basically, which looked at enterprise risk from a macro point of view. And they developed some guidelines, sort of steps in the process. Set your research, or set your risk objectives, identify potential disruptive events, assess the probabilities and magnitudes of those risks, and then respond to those risks when they do occur, and institute controls to prevent further occurrence of those events, and then monitor to make sure that you're implementing this process correctly. All that sounds well and good, but there are some flaws in this approach. We feel that traditional risk management has limitations, and I'll mention a few of them here. First of all, we can't always anticipate events, and so it's hard to analyze something that you haven't anticipated. Fukushima is a great example. No one saw that coming. Some companies responded very effectively. Others were caught flat-footed. Another limitation is the difficulty of risk assessment, especially for these high probability, low consequence events, which are very rare. It's hard to analyze those risks quantitatively. We don't have good historical data. Often we depend on expert judgment, and we all know that experts can be way off base. A lot of this is based on historical experience and biases. So we can't necessarily trust the calculus of risk assessment. The final point, which is really important, is that traditional response to risk has been to try to mitigate the consequences, reduce the likelihood of the risk, but it's focused on returning to normal. And the fact is, we may not want to return to normal. Maybe we need to learn lessons from these events or disruptions and adapt, change the configuration of the supply chains, perhaps reconsider the whole business model in order to be better prepared for the future. We are in a new normal now, so the traditional approach to business continuity simply may not be adequate. This slide depicts some possible strategies for managing organizations in turbulent times. And what we do here is distinguish between the magnitude of the change, so how severe is the disruption, versus the abruptness. Is it sudden or is it gradual? And in each case, there are different strategies. If you have small disruptions which are not so abrupt, which are fairly routine, that's in your lower left, well, you can steer and adjust appropriately. And that's where risk management really serves us best, because you do have a sort of statistical background to work from. On the other hand, for very large disruptions which occur gradually, that's in the upper left, things like climate change are examples of that. There are drastic changes occurring, but they're at a slow enough pace where we can adapt and perhaps even transform our enterprises to manage those better. We can reduce our energy use, reduce our water use, change our business practices. It gets more difficult if events are abrupt and unexpected. And in the lower right, of course, we can sense and respond to turbulent disruptions that are relatively minor, things like fires, pandemics, and so forth. But if something really major happens, a catastrophe that affects our entire supply chain, we really have to resort to new methods. We have to figure out how we can survive, not only survive the event, but flourish in the aftermath and perhaps do better than our competitors. And that's where resilience really comes into play. And we'll talk about some of the factors that enable a company to be more resilient in that scenario. I'm going to turn it over to Keely now, who's going to talk about some of the analyses that we've done.
So what you see on the screen here is results of a study that was done about what worries executives, what keeps them up at night. And we show this just to demonstrate that it's a broad range of types of disruptions. So it's easy to think about natural disasters and extreme weather, and those tend to be the examples that people go to first. But we're really looking across a broad range of possible disruptions. even down, as we'll talk about, to not just supply side, but demand side shocks as well. Why we need to think about this in the supply chain context is because the disruptions often occur outside our four walls. So you can see by the top bar that lots of the disruptions are in what I'll consider our controllable space. And that's good because at least we can control our reactions and our preparations for those things. But at the same time, there's all sorts of events that are happening outside of that space in the rest of the supply chain. If you look at not just Tier 1 suppliers, but also what's happening in Tier 2, and this study didn't go beyond that, but of course it could be disruptions back in the supply chain beyond that as well. And then we want to think not just about supply disruptions, which again I think is what most people think of, but also think about what can happen on the customer side. And usually we think of that as shocks to the demand. Could be in a positive direction in that a competitor maybe has a disruption and they're not able to keep up with demand and it didn't affect you. That's great if you can respond to that demand, but if you're not resilient to respond to that spike in demand, then that's a real lost opportunity. The demand disruption could come in the other direction, of course, as well. Something happens that significantly drops your demand, and you need to be able to survive that and hopefully come out of that growing the business in a different direction. So we do want to think about this not just within our own organization, but across the supply chain. Because the reality is we're only as resilient as our least resilient supply chain member. So we've got examples of companies doing all sorts of things to fortify, say, their own IT security to protect themselves against cybersecurity threats. Well, in a lot of cases, information is being shared with other members of the supply chain, and if folks that want to get that data can hack in through a supplier, it doesn't matter how much you fortified your four walls if there's opportunities with the supplier. So we need to think about not only what's going on in our organization, but how can we assess and try to manage what's happening elsewhere in the supply chain. Let me give you a couple examples. So everyone's familiar with the earthquake and tsunami back in 2011, and many of your businesses were probably affected by these events. If you're in the auto industry, you probably will be not surprised by some of these numbers, but for Toyota, their production fell by 63% in Japan. But to Joseph's point, it also affected their global production by as much as 30%. So this idea that we really have to take a global perspective, and what happens halfway around the world can impact you quite drastically is the reality for a lot of companies, the world they're living in. In the case of Toyota, it took them 6 months to return to pre-tsunami levels, so a very long recovery time. What's interesting about that recovery is that it was hampered by the flooding in Thailand just a couple months later. At the same time, the yen was surging, and so these were things that made it more difficult for Toyota to get back to their normal, if you will, and it had a significant impact on their quarterly profits. So this also gets back to one of the points Joseph made about the limitations of traditional risk management, because even if you were or could quantify the probability of one of those events, when you take that enterprise risk management approach, you think of it as one event at a time. And the reality is that sometimes there's a compounding effect of multiple events. And so really trying to just look more globally at how you can be resilient, whatever the circumstance might be, we think might be a better approach than really focusing in on one type of event at a time. Now, in the case of Toyota, having profits drop by nearly 20% and taking 6 months to get back to pre-production or pre-event production may suggest that they weren't as resilient as perhaps they'd hoped. But the good news is that they took this as a learning opportunity and are trying to be more proactive about finding ways to be resilient to these kinds of disruptions. Their goal is to have no future disruption have a recovery that's longer than 2 weeks. So that's a pretty bold goal, but they're taking some good steps to head towards that. One of the things they did was to work with suppliers to increase visibility. So they focused on their top 20 suppliers. I should say top 20. There are 20 suppliers that they thought presented the most risk, so top from a risk perspective, and worked with them to increase visibility. They spread production across multiple locations, so being able to produce products in different geographic locations so that if one gets hit, another could pick up that capacity. They increased their inventory buffers, which if you think of Toyota as being nearly synonymous with the lean movement, they spent years taking inventory out of their system. Events like this make you realize that being lean can be good in a lot of respects, but in a time of crisis or disruption, it can make your supply chain very brittle. And the fact that you've got these long global supply chains, if you don't have inventory, as we said, disruption anywhere in that supply chain can have a near immediate impact. So Toyota's rethinking their inventory strategy and thinking about where they can strategically place inventory to help them recover or withstand a disruption. And then the last one, they have looked at redesigning some of their components to standardize across models. And I find this one interesting because there's kind of the obvious reason to do that if you standardize parts, it provides flexibility in scheduling in a manufacturing environment, and so that alone may be a good reason to do it. But in the case of Toyota, the impetus for standardizing those parts was really to create the volumes for their suppliers so that they could negotiate with their suppliers to have additional manufacturing locations. So using the close collaboration that they have with their suppliers, they were able to say, look, we'll give you more volume, but we want you producing product in multiple geographic locations. So those are some of the things that Toyota's been working on. They also realized that some of their Tier 1 suppliers were using the same Tier 2 suppliers. So again, this idea that we need to think about the whole supply chain, having multiple Tier 1 suppliers and thinking, oh good, I'm covered in case of a disruption, doesn't work if those two suppliers are depending on the same Tier 2 supplier and the disruption impacts that Tier 2 supplier. So we really need to map the supply chain and understand where the capacity is. The second example I'll give you is more on the demand side. So if you're not familiar with Cardinal Health, they're one of the largest healthcare distributors in the country. And about 2.5 years ago, it was announced, Walgreens announced that they were not going to be renewing their contract with Cardinal Health to be their distributor. And for Cardinal Health, this represented 21% of their revenue. So a major shock to the supply chain into their system. Another data point from the slide that Joseph showed you, on par with the results of that study, their stock dropped 8.2% following that announcement. Compounding the pain of losing this large customer was the fact that CVS was also near their contract end and were getting ready to negotiate their contract. So it caused a bit of panic at Cardinal Health because it would seem that it might put CVS into a favorable position in their negotiations. So what seems like a bad situation, it was a bad situation for Cardinal Health, but if you look at it now, their stock price has risen about 80% since that disruption. So this idea of recovering and growing and being resilient to that disruption is something that I think Cardinal Health was able to do fairly well. And I think the quote below gives you some indication of how they did that. So this is from their CEO. It says, I think it's noteworthy that we're able to absorb this headwind and still grow. We've devoted much of the past 5 years positioning ourselves to grow in this environment. We've expanded our customer base and diversified. So they're able to foresee this possibility, this risk that they had 21% of their revenue with a single customer, and prepared for that by trying to reposition their market and diversify their customer and diversify their business. And so, yes, it's still a shock, and the Wall Street responded with an 8.2% drop in their stock price. But as a company, Cardinal Health was able to recover, and then, of course, the stock followed. So a couple different examples, one on the supply side and one on the demand side, about how companies can respond to disruptions, how they can learn from the disruptions, and in the case of Cardinal Health, perhaps prepare for them and survive them. So let me tell you a little bit about the SCRAM Framework and the research that we've done. As Joseph mentioned, it's been about a decade that we've been working on this with our research team. And it's really gone in three phases. In the first phase, we wanted to develop a comprehensive way to think about resilience, and we did that in terms of vulnerabilities and capabilities, and I'll talk about more about those in a bit. We then validated the framework with 7 organizations, and I think most importantly there, we're able to develop the linkages. So it's one thing to be able to come up with a list of vulnerabilities and a list of capabilities, but really the key for managers is to be able to see how those link together. What are the capabilities that we can build to mitigate the particular risks that we're facing? So we'll talk more about that as well. And then in the third phase, we worked quite extensively with Dow Chemical, and they really created a work process around this framework and rolled that out to 20 of their business units. And it was a process of assessing their resilience and then using that for better decision making. So our general framework, the general picture of how we're thinking about resilience is that it's about matching vulnerabilities and capabilities. And the idea is that you want to be in the zone of balanced resilience. So you'd like to be in that green space along the diagonal where if you have got low vulnerabilities, you haven't invested in excessive capabilities, you've got a set of capabilities to match that relatively low set of vulnerabilities. On the other hand, if you have a high level of vulnerabilities, then you build capabilities to match that as well. The risk, if you're not in that zone of balanced resilience, if you have high vulnerabilities and low capabilities, then you've exposed yourself to risk. On the other hand, if you've invested in capabilities beyond the inherent risk that you face, then you could be eroding profits because you're making investments where perhaps they're not value added. So in general, we want to be in this zone of balanced resilience. But as I said earlier, the key really is to not just say, well, I'm an 8 in vulnerabilities, so I need to be an 8 in capabilities, but to match the particular vulnerabilities and capabilities so that you're building the right set of capabilities, the right portfolio of capabilities. Let me talk a bit about vulnerabilities. We've got them into these 6 what we call factors, and each one of those has a list of sub-factors. And I won't be able to go through all of them, but let me just kind of highlight a couple to give you some examples of what falls into these various factors. So in the category of turbulence, we're talking about things like natural disasters, geopolitical disruptions, currency fluctuations, unpredictable demand, things that are causing just general turbulence in the business environment. Deliberate threats could be industrial espionage, piracy, and theft. If we think about external pressures, these are things that are maybe outside of your control but exert stresses and put risks on your supply chain. So things like competitive innovation, right? If the competitors are coming out with new products, that puts your products and your demand at risk. Things are going on in society and our cultural norms as things become more important to our society. They change the pressures that we put on companies. Corporate responsibility, environmental responsibility, those kinds of things are all external pressures. I think of Coca-Cola as a company that's exposed to a lot of external pressures, right? They use a lot of water, so they need to demonstrate that they're good stewards of the environment. There's special interest groups that put pressure on them because they link their products to obesity. So these are risk and vulnerability factors that a company like Coca-Cola has to deal with. As a last example, I'll focus on connectivity. This is some of the things that Joseph was talking about that are making supply chains more resilient, more brittle, more fragile in today's environment, and a greater need for resilience. So we think about things like the scale of the network being the supply chain or the complexity of that supply chain, the degree of outsourcing. If your supply chain is all contained within the United States, that's a very different risk exposure than if it's a global supply chain. So understanding those points of connectivity and the linkages within the members of the supply chain is important. So the idea here is that a company can evaluate their set of inherent vulnerabilities that they face. They then need to identify and assess their capabilities. So those fall into these 14 categories. And again, I don't have time to go through all of them, but I will focus on a few. one that's often talked about is flexibility in sourcing. So single sourcing is obviously a risk. The way Toyota dealt with that was not necessarily to have multiple suppliers, but to have their suppliers in multiple locations. So at least they have that geographic dispersion. Part commonality is another way to provide more flexibility in your manufacturing. Supplier contract flexibility. Limited, for example, one of their vulnerabilities is that they have a high degree of demand uncertainty, particularly at the time that they're planning their supply chain for their new season. They might be doing that anywhere from 6 to 10 months before the season. So they've got high demand unpredictability. One way they deal with that is building up the capability of having flexible supplier contracts. Another way to deal with risks is to have excess capacity, have reserve capacity, have redundancy, backup networks, backup communication systems, backup energy sources. The ability, for example, of adding capacity might be the ability to add a third shift in a manufacturing environment, right? So that if there's a disruption somewhere, you have excess capacity. So these, again, are kind of another category of capability factors. Another one that I would say Toyota was able to take advantage of is collaboration, and in their case, relationships with their suppliers. So the fact that they have close relationships with suppliers allows them to go in and ask for more visibility and ask for them to have multiple locations, doing things like collaborative forecasting, better communications with members of the supply chain. These are all things that can help in the time of crisis and essentially capabilities that you can take advantage of when you need them if there's a disruption. The last one I'll touch on is market position, because I think this one is interesting. I think when you think about supply chain disruptions, it's usually supply chain folks that are talking about that. And we think about the things that we can do either with our suppliers or within our four walls. But market position is also an important one. If you have customer loyalty, if you have strong brand equity, product differentiation, these are all things that, again, you can take advantage of in the time of crisis. I go back to Coke, right? We said Coke has a lot of external pressure, but on the other hand, one of their key capabilities is that they've got good customer loyalty, good brand equity, and that helps mitigate their risks. So really what this is all about is trying to find those capabilities that best match the menu or the constellation of risks that you face. One other question that we wanted to ask ourselves is, does this matter? Is there a benefit in building these capabilities and being resilient? One way that we have answered that is to start to look at some data with the companies we've worked with. So each one of these dots is a company that we've collected data from, and we need a larger data set to draw statistically significant conclusions, but we're starting to see results that we like. What we have here is the resilience score, which is a quantitative measure of the gaps between these companies' vulnerabilities and capabilities. And that's along the x-axis. Along the y-axis, we have their volatility of performance. So our hypothesis is that if a firm is resilient, then they won't see wild swings in their performance. So kind of those output metrics will remain stable regardless of what's going on in the internal environment or the input environment. And so what we looked at for these companies was whatever their key metrics were. Whether it was on-time delivery, quality, revenue, whatever their key metrics were, we looked at the volatility of those metrics. And so what you see is what we would hope. Those companies that were more resilient had less volatility in performance. So we feel like we're on the right track, both with our measurement scheme and with our ideas that this does matter and it can make a difference to companies' performance. Before I turn it over to Joseph, let me just touch on a couple other lessons learned. I think the key lesson that's come out of this for us is that companies need to think about developing this portfolio of capabilities. And if you can understand the vulnerabilities and then match those up to the capabilities. So the ideal situation is you've got a set of vulnerabilities that you face, that you've assessed and evaluated, and you can find, it's not a one-to-one matching between vulnerabilities and capabilities, right? So I might have a vulnerability. There may be 10 different ways, 10 different capabilities I could build to help me deal with that vulnerability. So I want to look at all my vulnerabilities and see which one of those capabilities or which set of capabilities will help me protect against multiple vulnerabilities. So that's kind of our key message, is that we want to find that right balance between capabilities and vulnerabilities and find that right portfolio of capabilities. Another thing that has come out of another research project related to this, we looked at middle market firms, and those are mid-sized companies, and we've learned a couple of interesting things. One is that risk tolerance plays a role in this, and companies of different size might have different tolerance for risk, but also that those capabilities tend to change as companies grow. So what are maybe some of the, quote, easier capabilities to develop for a large firm might look quite different than the ones that are, quote, easy to develop for a smaller firm. In particular, we found that the smaller firms, middle-sized firms, are better at quick decision-making. They have a shorter chain of command. They're better at working cross-functionally in a time of crisis. They're able to take advantage of employee loyalty as a smaller firm. So there's just different capabilities that they're able to rely on. We've also found that critical to all this is a culture of resilience, and it goes to some of those same things I just talked about: the ability to make quick decisions, the ability to mobilize resources in short order. Those are organizational cultural issues that are really inherent in the employees and in the organizational structure. And so we think there's some interesting work to be done at really understanding what those cultural aspects are and try and help companies develop those. As we saw from Toyota, we should look at disruptions as a learning opportunity. What can we learn from it, so that rather than just focusing on getting back to normal, we can focus on getting better visibility and maybe being able to view those risks in a different way, be able to maybe foresee risks better and respond better. And that we've seen some limitations of the traditional risk management approach, and believe that companies should really think about resilience as an inherent feature in their supply chain, not focused on mitigating any one particular risk, but really mitigating risks overall in supply chain. And finally, we found this to be a really neat and ripe area for collaboration between industry and academia. Academia sometimes gets a bad rap of being in the ivory tower, but we found that this is one area that is quite interesting to work directly with managers. With that, I'll turn it back over to Joseph.
Thank you, Keely. In the interest of time, I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit and just touch on a few other thoughts here. As Keely mentioned, we've analyzed a variety of different company experiences. One thing we've been searching for is the value proposition. This slide summarizes some of the value we've seen companies derive from adopting resilience approaches. They've been able to improve top-line growth by expanding into new markets, in some cases being able to outcompete other companies who were slow to respond to changes or to disruptions. They've been able to increase their profitability by avoiding downtime and costly recovery and so forth, better utilization of assets, in some cases actually realizing that they were over-investing in assets and were able to do some right-sizing to reduce overhead. Of course, reducing their risk and their risk premiums. And finally, very important, I think, is the intangible value associated with being resilient, responding quickly, building customer loyalty, helping communities that are afflicted by disasters. An example, our sponsor, UPS, has invested heavily in providing relief to communities all over the world that experience disasters, and I think it's helped tremendously with their brand positioning. I'd like to talk a bit about what we're doing here at Ohio State in the Sustainable and Resilient Economy program. And this actually goes beyond supply chain resilience. It really looks at enterprise resilience and looks at how enterprises are affected by different kinds of disruptions. We take as a starting point the fact that our economy is dependent upon both society and the environment, that all these systems are linked. We really take a systems approach towards understanding, for example, how enterprises provide value to communities, how communities support enterprises. So being situated in a stable and resilient and prosperous community helps tremendously with workforce satisfaction and, of course, society represents the investors in our companies. At the same time, we know that environmental resources are critical. The environment can be both a source of value in terms of providing resources and raw materials. It can also be a source of risk. And here I've just indicated a few points where disruptions can occur that can influence a company's ability to continually generate value for its customers. We've talked about a lot of these different kinds of disruptions. So we have adopted a sort of a systems approach where we think not only about how do you model supply chains and simulate potential disasters, but how do we model human behavior in communities, and how do we model the dependency of both companies and communities on natural resources. That's a big subject which we don't have time to cover, but it's a very important aspect in our work of understanding the linkage between resilience and sustainability. Sustainability is really a long-term play. It's making sure that a company is addressing the goals of society, which really are ultimately ensuring prosperity, protecting the environment, and enhancing social well-being. These are indirect results of a company's ability to generate value through its products and services. But in order to continue on that journey to sustainability, companies have to be resilient. And so resilience is kind of a prerequisite, a precondition for sustainability, because it provides continuity and avoids disruptions that can limit a company's ability to deliver value. At the same time, sustainable companies are more fit to deal with disruptions because they're more efficient, have better relationships with their stakeholders, and so forth. Just as an example, Keely mentioned earlier how Toyota was rethinking its lean strategy, and many companies are realizing that there's a trade-off between sustainability and resilience. In fact, if you want to become more resilient, it may actually involve having more assets, carrying more inventory, investing in resilience, and may actually reduce a company's sustainability. So on the lower right, for example, we see that redundancy creates a larger footprint and therefore reduces what we would call an ecological footprint or resource productivity. On the other hand, local sourcing is a way perhaps to offset those issues and create a more sustainable and resilient supply chain. I'm just going to close with what I find fascinating, the Chinese term for crisis. It consists of two characters. One represents danger, the other represents opportunity. I think that's a great summary of what we've talked about today. Yes, there's inherent risk in the environment, but companies that are able to manage those risks and be more resilient will find opportunities to compete effectively and to create shareholder value. In our Sustainable and Resilient Economy program, our mission is to help develop more sustainable and resilient production and consumption systems. We think these are both important goals, and companies that can achieve a balance between them will ultimately succeed in their marketplace. Our program is part of something called Discovery Themes, which is an effort by Ohio State to address the great challenges that face the world today. And you can learn more if you go to that website, discovery.osu.edu. I also would like to mention a book that is just getting published next month. It's called Resilient by Design. And if you want to learn more, you can go to the Island Press website. I'd like to, before I turn it over to Michael, I just want to thank our colleagues, co-authors, Tim Pettit, who's with the Air Force, and Michaela Polyview, who is a doctoral candidate here at Ohio State University. Thank you very much for your attention.
So that concludes the presentation portion of our program today. I want to make a quick note to thank UPS for their sponsorship of this webinar and of the Q&A we will now move into. We've gotten lots of great questions, and we'll continue to take your questions for the remainder of this hour, as well as via Twitter for the next 80 minutes or so. So a reminder that you can submit your questions by entering them into the chat box in the lower left corner of the webinar screen, or on Twitter using the hashtag #MITSMRDisruption. So I'm going to just plunge right in. I don't know if we're going to be able to get through all of these questions in the remainder of our next 20 minutes, but certainly we will be able to do it on Twitter if not. So one of the questions that I thought was brought up early on in your discussion was around why environmental issues are thought to be uninfluenceable, and I wondered if you two could expand a bit more on when we can and cannot react effectively to environmental events.
I'll answer that one. It's very difficult for any single company to influence these sort of external business environment or natural environment kinds of factors. For example, how is a company going to change the climate? Now, as a world of nations, we perhaps can influence climate over time, but we don't view that as a factor that's controllable by an individual firm.
Okay, and why are the number of these disasters seemingly increasing so rapidly?
I touched on that earlier. We see a number of factors. One is greater climate extremes, of course, but also simply the greater complexity and connectivity of global supply chains. The trend towards globalization and outsourcing has resulted in many different points of exposure along the supply chains. And in addition, as I mentioned, our markets are changing and demographics are changing. So we have concentrations of populations that are crowded together in megacities like Mumbai or Mexico City. And if any disruption occurs there, it can turn into a massive disaster. Moreover, we have this phenomenon of what's called cascading consequences. So something that happens in one part of the world and can cascade in multiple ways and affect other parts of the world through economic or political influences. So we live on a tightly connected planet. I think that's a big factor. These disruptions represent events that have either high mortality or high cost in terms of property damage. So the more people and the more property there is at risk, the greater the disaster.
Do the vulnerability, ratios change when you're in less developed countries?
I think the vulnerabilities that any particular organization faces has multiple factors. One certainly is the development of that country. I think in various regards. The less developed a country is, the fewer resources it has to deal with the disruption and to respond to it. I think the less developed a country is, perhaps the impact of a disruption will be higher, stronger. So yeah, I think that the economic development of the location of the disruption can have an impact on both the impact of the disruption itself as well as the ability for organizations to recover.
And can you if you're building a supply chain and you're going into a lesser developed area, do you want to is there ways to account for that potential?
Let me mention one thing that some of the companies we've worked with have observed, and that's the workforce. A very important aspect of resilience is the capability of individuals to respond effectively to emergencies, to be versatile, have multiple skills, and to be accountable for decision-making in times of crisis. And often the workforce in less developed countries is not at the same level of capability. So they have to account for that in their planning.
It's part of that culture that we were talking about, having a culture of recovery and resilience.
Sure. I guess I'm probing a little bit further, and it sounds like what we're looking for, some of the questioners are looking for, this idea of can you quantify that? Are there tools that you can use to build equations around that help you quantify the risk or create a different kind of ratio to reflect those kinds of things?
Well, we have developed a tool based on our SCRAM framework, which allows a company to at least qualitatively rate its capabilities. And that's what Dow Chemical has been using, for example. That's still a qualitative approach. It's very hard to actually scientifically quantify these things, at least at present. But that is helpful, and that's the basis of the resilience ratio that Keely described earlier.
And I think there's some risk in trying to, as Joseph pointed out when he talked about the limitations of enterprise risk management. There's some risks, not to overuse the term risk, but there's some risk in trying to quantify things that perhaps shouldn't be quantified, because sometimes when we quantify things, then we spend too much time thinking about the number and less time just thinking about how to deal with the issue.
Yeah, we start to believe our own numbers, which can be dangerous.
A good point. I wanted to shift gears slightly to perhaps, I'm not sure if you would call this a black swan event or a crisis, but we had a question about the current situation that Volkswagen is facing around, here in the U.S. at least, around its having cheated on standards. And the question is, what repercussions would you expect to occur across the supply chain for Volkswagen?
That's kind of a reverse question. You're asking how their supply chain will be impacted?
The question is, what repercussions do you expect to see in the supply chain based on, in the wake of the current crisis for VW?
I think the major impacts will be on the market, on their brand and reputation, customers' willingness to purchase a Volkswagen regardless of whether it's affected, whether it's diesel or not. I think as far as supply chain impact, it could affect supplier loyalty. It could certainly affect their ability to secure long-term contracts and so forth, but I think those are more minor effects. Don't you, Keely?
Yeah, I agree. I think depending on what happens with Volkswagen's market, as Joseph pointed out, if there's a shift in the market, then the suppliers that are heavily dependent on Volkswagen are going to see perhaps some impact on their business. But I think most of those suppliers typically are working with the other auto manufacturers as well, so they probably have the opportunity to recover.
Are there differences between the ways that a manufacturing company and say a services company like a utility will be affected by events or need to manage their supply chains with these kinds of events in mind?
Well, you mentioned utilities. They are actually champions of resilience in many ways, because at least in this country, we very rarely have power disruptions. We've had a few catastrophes. The industry has worked very hard to reduce the likelihood of those. But like every winter, we have winter storms, and the response of utilities is to mobilize not only their employees, but employees from many different partners that they have around the country. And so they're able within days to restore power to communities that are affected by these storms. That's one of the case studies we looked at. Of course, that's very different from a manufacturing situation. There's a whole different set of characteristics and capabilities that a utility needs to think about.
And can the private and public sectors, I guess, learn from each other? Can they follow some similar approaches, or are they pretty different in the way that they need to react to or be resilient?
The public sector is starting to pay attention to resilience. In fact, very recently, President Obama issued an executive order on resilience, and he's commissioned a task force to examine community resilience, because this is now recognized as a threat to both national security and to economic continuity. So there's a lot of attention being paid by federal agencies. And one of the issues we're recognizing is what they call the food, energy, water nexus, the fact that our infrastructures are all interconnected. Saw in Superstorm Sandy how the coastal flooding actually brought down the power systems because transformers were located in basements. And so this coupling of infrastructures increases our exposure. And one way to be more resilient is to decouple those interdependencies.
And I know that in the wake of Katrina, obviously, the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Manager, started doing things like very broad-based resiliency practice runs, in effect. Is that a good idea for private organizations as well, to sort of do dry runs, or is that pretty standard? Was that pretty standard ahead of time, and this is just an example of the government catching up with private industry practice?
I think it is standard practice for most companies to do drills, emergency drills, especially, for example, in the chemical industry where you have the possibility of hazardous spills and so forth. Most manufacturing facilities have routine rehearsals for emergencies. What's more challenging is when you have a catastrophe, you have an entire community affected, let's say by flooding, and there's a need for collaboration among companies, local governments, and citizens, and that's where FEMA comes in and other agencies that need to help the community to coordinate all these different emergency responders.
We had a series of questions about how to manage, how to balance the sort of risks. And one question related to, does outsourcing help companies balance risk? Does it either they're reducing their vulnerability or increasing their capability to respond?
I think outsourcing can be a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you typically you lose control, right, when you outsource. And so you may not have the visibility into what's going on in those organizations or in the rest of the supply chain. You might not have visibility to your second-tier suppliers as much as you would if you were doing it yourself. On the other hand, they can be a way to mitigate the risk by having more flexible capacity. So it depends a little bit about, I think, how those outsourced relationships are managed. I think in the face of resilience, companies need to be careful about how they manage those those outsourced relationships. But they can use them as a capability. But they do need to be careful because I think they can also present some vulnerabilities.
You mentioned earlier the workforce and the broader kind of skill sets that are available to help workers respond more effectively. We got a question, a comment actually, thanking you for your excellent presentation and insights, I should note. But also, they wanted to know what shifts you were seeing in the portfolio of skills that supply chain leaders will need now, or perhaps are going to start to need, or will need in the future, versus where they were 5 years ago.
I think that it gets back a bit maybe to this idea of the organizational culture and being able to respond quickly, to make effective decisions, be able to interact cross-functionally. I think a lot of disruptions affect multiple parts of the organization in different ways, and so to be able to understand the roles and the responsibilities of the other functions and to come up with solutions across the organization. So I think I don't know how you teach quick thinking and train for quick thinking, but I think some of it's what Joseph said about enabling your employees to make decisions, particularly in the time of a disruption or crisis.
Well, it sounds like you're also saying that you want to encourage more, collaboration across organizations within a company, sort of break down silos, do some exercises around team building of that sort, perhaps?
Yeah, perhaps. And I think that's where we've seen some of the advantage of some of these medium-sized companies is that their environment is naturally more collaborative across functions. In most cases, for a medium-sized company, all the VPs are in the same building, and as you get to a national company, that's not true. So even the geographic location of your executives or your managers plays a role in your ability to work cross-functionally. So the extent to which you can, in an environment where you don't naturally have that collaboration happening as easily, the extent to which you can foster it both in times of stability and then take advantage of it in times of disruption.
I'll give you one quick example. I mentioned we work with utilities, and American Electric Power, for example, their employees have two distinct roles. They have their normal role, which could be in accounting or marketing or whatever, and then they have a winter storm role, where they are assigned to a whole different functions. It could be about communications or actually working in the field, advising citizens about emergency precautions. And so about half the company gets mobilized into these new roles whenever a disruption occurs. So you need that kind of diversity and willingness to shift quickly to a different mode of operation.
And what about the sort of, are there ways to sort of measure your cost challenges to balance out the kind of cost of really building a resilient supply chain for the Black Swan events versus what it would cost to just assume that most of the time things will be business as usual? What are some effective methods that you've seen companies use to, could you talk a bit about effective ways that companies have been able to kind of deal with that risk-return ratio?
In the case of Dow Chemical, we've actually gone a lot further than what we described today. We've been able to create simulation models where a business unit can actually estimate costs associated with different kinds of scenarios and can estimate the potential exposure that they have. So looking at the trade-offs in terms of the cost of resilience versus the cost of doing nothing. So there are some methods there, but they require a lot more effort if you really want to quantify the value of resilience. Now, our thinking is that really the best approach is to have what they call no regrets resilience, in the sense that you build capabilities that minimize the cost and maybe even have some advantages because they create a more efficient organization, but still give you those resilience capabilities. That would be the ideal.
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasize that I think a lot of the capabilities have other advantages beyond how you respond in a disruption. So if you think about collaboration, right, having collaborative relationships with customers and suppliers provide value in your day-to-day operations. So you don't need to cost justify that purely on the resilience basis. It may be that it just creates a better company that's able to respond to day-to-day business and day-to-day growth and all the things you're trying to do. So I think the extent to which you can develop these capabilities that are good anyways, then you don't have to worry about justifying the cost from mitigating a risk.
Okay. We have a Twitter question. Can you build in resiliency for a firm that is faced with geopolitical conflict by further globalizing your supply chain?
One way to diffuse geopolitical conflict is to have much more local autonomy rather than having a company that's headquartered, let's say, in the developed world, in Europe or whatever, and is trying to manage facilities all over the world, trying to decentralize and have indigenous people well-trained to manage those. They have good relationships with their communities. A lot of companies are moving towards that model. I think it's much more effective for dealing with abnormal situations.
Can you talk actually just a bit about how much the practice of resiliency has changed since you started studying this? Have there been a couple of significant changes you could just highlight for us?
Well, what I've observed is there's been a tremendous increase in the level of interest in resilience. If you just count the number of publications, it's just going up exponentially. I think a lot of companies are paying attention. At the Davos Summit, which is kind of a strategy summit for global companies, the subject of resilience has become increasingly important. The World Economic Forum does a global risk report, which used to talk about risks in a traditional way as kind of single-point risks, and now has shifted to looking at what they call systemic resilience, recognizing that events are interconnected and that a social disruption can result in a supply chain disruption, which can influence economic well-being and so forth. So the answer is yes. There's been a lot of change, greater awareness, greater recognition that this is an imperative for businesses.
So I think we have time just for one last question on the phone, and then we're going to have to move to Twitter. And I wanted to close with a question around, when you're trying to change your company culture to create a more resilient culture, what would your first steps be?
Call us. Seriously.
Read your book?
Just buy my book. Seriously, I think the first step is simply doing a sort of internal assessment. trying to understand the level of resilience that you're at, like what's the baseline. And actually the SCRAM tool that we have developed is a good tool for doing that. It provides a sort of current snapshot. Want to comment, Keely?
Yeah, I think just understanding across the organization where the vulnerabilities lie is when we go talk to companies, we try to talk to people in all the different functions because everybody's got their own perspective. And sometimes what one person thinks is a high risk, somebody else doesn't agree. And so just getting a common understanding of what the real risks are, and then what the capabilities that the company has, and get everybody an appreciation for how those capabilities can be used to be more resilient. So I think that's a good place to start. Then you can start thinking about some of the other things we talked about around being able to be cross-functional and make quick decisions and organize in the time of a disruption. Then you get into more of those things. But I think it seems like a good baseline is just across the organization an understanding of those vulnerabilities and capabilities.
So perhaps organize a resiliency retreat.
Yep.
All right. Well, we're going to have to move this to Twitter now. This concludes our this portion of our program. We want to say thank you again to our sponsor, UPS, and we are going to continue this conversation on Twitter at #MITSMRDisruption. I do want to remind all the participants and attendees that a recording of this program and the presentation slides will be made available to you within 2 to 3 business days. Thank you very much for attending our program today, and we'll hope to see you on Twitter.